Hi, my name is Tori and I am a doctor of physical therapy who specializes in pelvic dysfunction, which means I treat things that can go wrong around the pelvis, and this includes sexual dysfunction. Recently, I have been working on a series dedicated to better understanding and figuring out how to treat female low sex drive or female low libido, and currently I am focused on hormones, specifically the sex hormones, and how they might affect female libido. Now, there are 3 female sex hormones: progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. And there is virtually no controversy surrounding progesterone and how it influences female libido. The scientific community essentially agrees that progesterone has a negative influence on female sex drive, which means when there are high levels of progesterone present, we'd expect low levels of sex drive. However, when it comes to estrogen and testosterone, there is so much controversy surrounding how these hormones might influence female libido. Namely, the controversy surrounds the question, which hormone, estrogen or testosterone, is primarily responsible for regulating and increasing female libido. Some scientists, doctors, researchers, etc. will claim that it's estrogen. Others will claim that it's testosterone, and still others will claim that it's a combination of the two. I think the research supports that estrogen is the primary hormone responsible for regulating and increasing female sex drive. And I think the story of how testosterone was considered, let alone even got into the running, is equally as fascinating as honestly it is disturbing. And I want to present the research and tell the story so that you can formulate your own opinions surrounding this controversy. But more than anything, I think that women and people with female anatomy deserve to understand what science thinks it knows about their bodies. And I can't find anything on the internet that explains what I've learned in a way that's easy to understand. So that's what I hope to make today. In order to get the most out of today's video, it would be helpful to have an understanding of the sex hormones and how they function in a woman's body throughout her lifetime. I will cover and review these topics as they come up, but if you're looking for a more comprehensive review, you can check out this video that I made for the female low libido series. With all of that being said, links to any and all studies that I mentioned today can be found in the description below, as well as timestamps if you want to skip around. And without further ado, let's begin. Right off the bat, it would be really interesting if testosterone was the primary hormone responsible for regulating and increasing female libido, because that would make humans the exception amongst all of the other non-human mammals that we've studied. All of the other female mammals that we've researched, from rats to monkeys, respond to estrogen, not testosterone, when it comes to regulating their sexual behaviors. So why would humans be the exception? To understand how testosterone got a seat at this table, we have to go back to when it was first discovered in the 1930s. Following its discovery, testosterone therapy was widely prescribed for an array of conditions to both men and women. However, the amount of testosterone prescribed far surpassed the amount of testosterone that female bodies naturally produce. Interestingly enough, the women who were receiving these really high doses of testosterone started anecdotally reporting that their sex drives, their libidos, were increasing. They also reported the development of unwanted male characteristics like facial and body hair, lowered voices, and clitoral enlargement. Regardless, because these anecdotal reports included increased libido, researchers in the 1940s decided to study specifically how high doses of testosterone affect libido in women of all ages. And they found that it increased women's libido 100% of the time. What's interesting about this study is that it also investigated combination hormone therapy that included both testosterone and estrogen in postmenopausal women. Estrogen therapy was also developed and prescribed in the 1930s. This study found that while testosterone by itself did increase libido in these postmenopausal women, estrogen and testosterone together were more effective in increasing their libido than testosterone was by itself. Furthermore, a study published in 1949 by Dr. William Perloff detailed that the estrogen therapy that he was prescribing to the postmenopausal women that he was treating consistently resulted in reports of increased sex drive. I want to pause here and remind you why postmenopausal women would be of special interest when it comes to trying to figure out which hormone is primarily responsible for female libido. Recall that hormones in general are a part of the endocrine system, and that the endocrine system is made up of a collection of organs known as endocrine glands that create and release hormones into the bloodstream. These endocrine glands are located in our brains, necks, torsos, abdomens, and pelvises. The female sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, are produced by two groups of endocrine glands: the adrenal glands, which live in our abdomens on top of our kidneys, and the ovaries, which live in our pelvises and are a part of the internal female reproductive system. Now, menopause is defined as the point in time when a woman stops getting her period, or when a woman stops menstruating. It is the permanent stopping of her menstrual cycle, and it can happen one of two ways: surgically or naturally. Surgically, a woman will experience menopause if both of her ovaries are removed. That's because without her ovaries, she will no longer produce eggs, which means she will no longer ovulate. And without ovulation, her menstrual cycle will permanently stop. Naturally, on the other hand, all women will eventually stop ovulating. That's because we're born with all of the eggs that we're ever going to have, and eventually we run out. In this case, menopause is usually diagnosed in retrospect, when a woman has gone 12 months without getting her period. In either version of menopause, surgically induced or naturally induced, the woman's body will produce significantly lower levels of the sex hormones, which can have a negative impact on her libido, making postmenopausal women of special interest when it comes to trying to figure out which sex hormone is primarily responsible for female libido. So, to recap, both testosterone and estrogen were developed and prescribed in the 1930s as hormone therapies. Women taking high doses of testosterone anecdotally reported increases in their sex drives, as well as the development of unwanted male characteristics. In the 1940s, the effect of these high doses of testosterone specifically on women's libido was studied, and it was found that high doses of testosterone increase women's libido of all ages 100% of the time. This same study also demonstrated that in postmenopausal women, while high doses of testosterone increased their libido, combination hormone therapy that included both testosterone and estrogen, was more effective at increasing their libidos than testosterone therapy was by itself. And in 1949, Dr. William Perloff published his findings that the estrogen therapy that he was prescribing to the postmenopausal women that he was treating consistently resulted in reports of increased libido. However, despite the evidence that estrogen was also probably worth considering when it came to the study of female libido, we continued to focus our attention on testosterone. At this point in history, we thought that in female bodies, the ovaries primarily produced estrogen and the adrenal glands primarily produced testosterone. We now know that's not the case, but regardless, if we pretend that it is the case, if testosterone is the primary hormone responsible for regulating female libido, and the adrenal glands are what primarily produce testosterone in female bodies, then one way to study just how much testosterone affects female libido would be to study sexual behavior in women before and after the surgical removal of their adrenal glands. And that's exactly what Sheldon Waxenberg and his colleagues aimed to investigate in their 1959 study, The Role of Hormones in Human Behavior: Changes in Female Sexuality After Adrenalectomy. Adrenalectomy is the medical term for the removal of the adrenal glands. Here's how they set up the study. They measured sexual behavior in 29 women who had undergone the removal of both their adrenal glands and their ovaries in response to terminal breast cancer. Of these 29 women, 7 of them had already had their ovaries removed, and the other 22 were going to get both their adrenal glands and ovaries removed at the exact same time. The authors found that of these 17 women who reported an intact libido prior to their surgery, 14 reported a significant decline in libido after their surgery. They also found that of the 7 women who had previously gotten their ovaries removed, 5 of them reported a significant decrease in libido following that surgery, and 6 of them reported another significant decrease in their libido following the removal of their adrenal glands. Waxenberg and his colleagues took these findings to mean that the ovaries had little impact on female libido and that the adrenal glands had a major impact on female libido. Remember, it's 1959 and we think that the ovaries primarily produce estrogen in female bodies and that the adrenal glands primarily produce testosterone. So Waxenberg's findings translated to estrogen doesn't really impact female libido and testosterone has everything to do with female libido. Before we accept these conclusions, let's unpack this study a little bit more. First of all, this study only included women who had both their adrenal glands and ovaries removed. There was no adrenalectomy only group, which means the study can't demonstrate the importance of only the adrenal glands. It can only demonstrate the importance of both the adrenal glands and the ovaries when it comes to regulating female libido. Second of all, the women included in this study were navigating terminal breast cancer. They had all undergone at least 2 major surgeries throughout the course of their treatment, and 22 of them had also undergone the removal of their breasts. Can we be sure that the reports of decreased libido following the removal of both their adrenal glands and their ovaries is solely due to the removal of their adrenal glands? Or is there room to question that maybe navigating a terminal cancer diagnosis and recovering from at least 2, if not 3, major surgeries might have had a negative impact on their libido? In my humble opinion, the only conclusion that can be drawn from this study is that in women with terminal breast cancer diagnoses, the removal of both their ovaries and their adrenal glands negatively impacts their sex drive. However, despite this study's limitations, it had a massive impact and really popularized the idea that the adrenal glands and their production of testosterone were what primarily influenced female libido. This idea guided hormone therapy in postmenopausal women for the next 20 plus years. In fact, you can still find articles written today that cite this study as proof of just how important testosterone is in regulating female libido. By the 1970s, we started studying how the female sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone fluctuate during a woman's menstrual cycle. Recall that there are 3 phases of the menstrual cycle: the follicular phase, the ovulatory phase, and the luteal phase. If we use a 28-day cycle as our example, where day 1 is the first day the woman bleeds, or the beginning of her period, day 14 is when she ovulates, and day 28 is the last day before she begins her next period, then the follicular phase can be simplified to the first 14 days of our 28-day example cycle. During this phase, the uterus sheds its lining, aka the woman gets her period, and her ovaries start to grow follicles, which contain eggs, hence the follicular phase. The ovulatory phase begins when the dominant follicle ruptures and releases its egg, aka when the woman begins to ovulate. Finally, the luteal phase begins after ovulation. The ruptured follicle closes, and the uterus thickens in preparation for a fertilized egg to implant, aka for the woman to become pregnant. If this doesn't happen, the uterus sheds its lining, the woman gets her period, and the follicular phase begins again. With this in mind, also recall that in the 1970s, it was widely accepted that the ovaries produced estrogen, the adrenal glands produced testosterone, and testosterone was the hormone in charge of regulating female libido. If this were the case, we would expect that estrogen would fluctuate during a female's menstrual cycle, especially when the ovaries are producing and releasing their eggs when a woman is ovulating. We would also expect that testosterone didn't really change, didn't really fluctuate very much during the menstrual cycle because the adrenal glands have nothing to do with ovulation. Well, Dr. Guy Abraham's 1974 study found that while estrogen fluctuates, as was expected during the menstrual cycle, so did testosterone. Estrogen actually peaks twice during the menstrual cycle. The first larger peak happens leading up to ovulation, and the second happens during the luteal phase in preparation for a potential pregnancy. As it turns out, testosterone also has a mid-cycle peak that coincides with estrogen's first peak. So clearly, the ovaries have something to do with the production of testosterone. Dr. Abraham took his study one step further and decided to investigate what would happen if he gave women an adrenal gland suppressant, ultimately leaving any and all testosterone production to their ovaries. He found that while testosterone's fluctuation pattern throughout the menstrual cycle remained unchanged, that the the levels of testosterone in the female body decreased by 20 to 50%. So he used these findings to conclude that the adrenal glands produce no more than 50% of female testosterone and that the rest must be produced by the ovaries. So to recap, it's the 1970s and we've got a pretty good understanding of how the sex hormones fluctuate throughout a woman's menstrual cycle, and we have pretty strong evidence to suggest that not only are the ovaries primarily responsible for the production of estrogen, but they are also primarily responsible for at least 50% of the production of testosterone in female bodies. Great, but what does that tell us about which hormone is primarily responsible for female libido? There is an important difference in how the ovaries and the adrenal glands release their sex hormones. The ovaries release their hormones in fluctuation, which means that at different times they release different amounts of sex hormones. The adrenal glands, on the other hand, release their hormones steadily, which means that at any given time, they are releasing a consistent amount of those hormones. So with that in mind, it would make sense that if female libido was regulated by the hormones that the ovaries produce, we would expect female libido to fluctuate throughout the menstrual cycle, and we would expect that if the ovaries were surgically removed, female libido would decrease. There would be a negative impact on female libido. If, on the other hand, female libido was under the control of the testosterone produced by the adrenal glands, we wouldn't expect female libido to change throughout the menstrual cycle, nor would we expect female libido to be affected by the surgical removal of the ovaries. It was proven over and over and over again in the 1980s and 1990s that not only does female libido fluctuate throughout the menstrual cycle, but it also does so in a predictable pattern. And in 1985, Dr. Barbara Sherwin and her colleagues published a study that proved almost without a shadow of a doubt that female libido was under the control of the ovarian hormones, not the adrenal hormones. Her study followed 53 healthy premenopausal women before and after the surgical removal of their ovaries, and found that after the surgery, their libido significantly decreased. This study was very important because its findings contradicted Waxenberg's and demonstrated that the adrenal gland's production of testosterone alone could not maintain these women's libidos in the absence of ovarian hormones. So, by the 1990s, given the strong, dare I say, indisputable evidence collected over the last 15 years or so, it was generally accepted that the ovarian sex hormones regulated female libido, not the adrenal glands. Again, great, but what does that tell us about which ovarian sex hormone, estrogen or testosterone, is primarily responsible for female libido? One way to try and answer that question would be to revisit how female libido predictably fluctuates during the menstrual cycle and try to decipher which hormone is responsible for that fluctuation. Humans are really interesting to study because we aren't bound to our biology. We can override biological impulses, and we don't always do what biologically makes sense for personal reasons, cultural reasons, social reasons, what have you. For example, even if a woman really wants to have heterosexual sex, she might choose not to because, let's say, she doesn't have a condom and she doesn't want to risk pregnancy. That being said, from a biological perspective, it would make the most sense if a woman's sex drive increased leading up to and during ovulation, because if she has more sex during this time in her menstrual cycle, she would be more likely to get pregnant. And that's the predictable pattern that we see when we study female libido and the menstrual cycle. So what's happening to the hormone levels during this time? Estrogen and testosterone both increase and peak leading up to and during ovulation. But look at the difference in magnitude between the two. Estrogen levels increase by more than 800% over a 3 to 4 day period during this time, where testosterone levels only increase by 150% over a 6 to 8 day period. Given the stark difference in magnitude between estrogen and testosterone when a woman's sex drive is the highest during her menstrual cycle, the fact that Waxenberg and his colleagues were very wrong about testosterone and the adrenal glands, and that every other female mammal that we study responds to estrogen, not testosterone, when it comes to the regulation of their sexual behaviors, it might be tempting to claim that estrogen is probably the hormone responsible for female libido in humans. However, that still isn't quite enough evidence, which is why in the 2000s we finally turned to studying the natural ovarian hormone levels in women and changes in their sex drive. In 2002, Dr. Lorraine Dennerstein and her colleagues followed 226 perimenopausal women as they transitioned from early menopause to late menopause. During this time, they tracked the women's natural levels of ovarian sex hormones and changes in their libido and other sexual behaviors. They found that estrogen levels significantly related to changes in libido and other sexual behavior, and that testosterone levels did not relate significantly with any measure of sexuality. Even with this study's findings and all of the other evidence that we've discussed, pharmaceutical companies were still very interested in producing a testosterone-based therapy that could treat low libido in women. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry if they get it right. Think about the success that they've had with other products like Viagra. So in 2001, a collection of experts in women's sexual health held a conference in Princeton, New Jersey, known as the Princeton Conference, to try and really unpack and understand the role that testosterone plays in women's sexual health. A quick note, the word androgen is the scientific term for male sex hormones, of which testosterone is one. Back to the conference. The results of this conference, published in 2002, included a new diagnosis: female androgen insufficiency, which was defined as a collection of clinical symptoms like low libido that were the result of low levels of testosterone. And of course, the recommended treatment for this insufficiency was testosterone therapy. My favorite part about the development of this diagnosis is that it was based entirely on expert opinion and experience, and that there was absolutely no data that proved that the symptoms of female androgen insufficiency were actually related to low levels of testosterone in females. Regardless, Big Pharma is running with this new female androgen insufficiency diagnosis and is pouring loads of money into the research and development of testosterone therapies that can treat low libido in women. At this time, there was no FDA-approved testosterone therapy for women, so again, this could be a multi-billion-dollar discovery for these companies. In 2004, Procter & Gamble and Watson Pharmaceuticals tried very hard to fast-track the FDA approval of a testosterone therapy called Intrinsa, a testosterone patch created for women suffering from low libido and other symptoms of female androgen insufficiency. The FDA rejected Intrinsa, claiming that it was worried about the potential side effects that could come from its long-term use, like, I don't know, the development of unwanted male characteristics, facial hair, body hair, lowered voices, clitoral enlargement, all the stuff that happened to the women who took really high doses of testosterone over long periods of time in the 1930s. Maybe? It wasn't until 2005, 3 years after the creation of the diagnosis female androgen insufficiency and 1 year after the development of Intrinsa, that someone decided to investigate whether or not the levels of natural testosterone in women could predict the symptoms of female androgen insufficiency. And guess what? They can't. So, female androgen insufficiency was found to be an unreliable, invalid diagnosis. However, it still contributed to the idea that testosterone, not estrogen, was the hormone primarily responsible for female libido. And while there still are no FDA-approved testosterone therapies for women, testosterone continues to be prescribed off-label to treat females with low libido. I want to pause here and remind you that my intention behind creating this video is not to disprove that testosterone therapy increases female libido. We've known since the 1940s that women taking high doses of testosterone report increased libido. My intention is to share the research and tell the story so that you can decide on your own which hormone, estrogen or testosterone, regulates female libido naturally. And I will also explain why testosterone therapy improving female libido actually supports the hypothesis that estrogen is that primary hormone in a little bit. Before I speak more about the successes and failures of both estrogen and testosterone-based hormone therapies, I want to call your attention to one more study that investigates women's natural ovarian sex hormone levels and changes in their libido. In 2013, doctors James Roney and Zachary Simmons studied the relationship between the ovarian sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, and female libido across the menstrual cycle. They followed 43 naturally cycling women, which means that none of these women were taking hormonal birth control or any other medication that might affect their hormone levels, and took samples of their hormone levels every day over a period of 1 to 2 menstrual cycles. Meanwhile, these women were completing a questionnaire every day that measured their libido and other sexual behaviors. Like I said way back in the very beginning of this video, there's virtually no controversy surrounding progesterone and how it influences female libido. The scientific community essentially agrees that it is a negative predictor of female libido, which means that high levels of progesterone are associated with low levels of libido. And that's exactly what Roney and Simmons found in their study. However, they also found that estrogen was a positive predictor of libido, meaning that high levels of estrogen were associated with high levels of libido and low levels of estrogen were associated with low levels of libido. But get this, they found that testosterone never reliably predicted libido or any other sexual behavior at any point during the study. So the evidence that estrogen, not testosterone, is the primary hormone responsible for regulating female libido is pretty convincing in my opinion. But if that's the case, why doesn't estrogen-based hormone therapy work for so many women suffering from low libido, and why does testosterone therapy work so well? Everything we've reviewed in this video suggests that estrogen is the hormone that is associated with an increased libido in women. But what levels of estrogen produce that positive change in sex drive? The levels associated with ovulation. Remember, biologically, that's what makes sense. Through a biological lens, we would expect a woman's sex drive to increase leading up to and during ovulation, because if she has sex during this time, she is more likely to become pregnant. When we examine ineffective estrogen-only hormone therapies, we find that these therapies do not raise estrogen levels to the same level that we see leading up to and during ovulation. Said another way, in naturally cycling premenopausal women, we see estrogen levels ranging between 100 to 400 picograms per milliliter leading up to and during ovulation. These ineffective estrogen-only therapies tend to only increase estrogen levels to 40 to 70 picograms per milliliter. In fact, when we administer estrogen-only therapies to postmenopausal women that mimic the level of estrogen that we see leading up to and during ovulation, those women will report increased libido about 80% of the time. However, when we administer low levels of estrogen and high levels of testosterone to postmenopausal women, we get very similar results. Reports of increased libido about 80% of the time. Why? Why, given all of the evidence that we've collected, would testosterone be so effective in raising female libido? We don't know, but this 2015 systematic review presents a very interesting hypothesis. So, we know that testosterone can be metabolized or turned into estrogen by different parts of the female body. Our breast tissue, fat tissue, bony tissue, and brain tissue can all turn testosterone into estrogen, to name a few examples. What if high doses of testosterone increase a woman's libido because they indirectly raise the levels of estrogen in her body? Furthermore, recall that hormones travel in our bodies via our bloodstream. There is a protein found in our blood that binds to both estrogen and testosterone, but it does so reversibly, which means a bound hormone can also be unbound. However, when a hormone is bound to this protein, it is considered biologically inactive, which means it does not have an effect on the person's body when it's bound. This protein prefers to bind to testosterone. In fact, it is twice as likely to bind to testosterone than it is to estrogen. Because this protein prefers to bind to testosterone, increasing testosterone levels would increase the amount of this protein bound to testosterone, which would free previously bound estrogen? What if high doses of testosterone increase a woman's sex drive because they indirectly increase the amount of biologically active free estrogen in her bloodstream? As I said, we don't know, and we need to do more research before we can come to any valid or reliable conclusions. However, I think it's safe to say that even though high levels of external testosterone increase female libido, we cannot prove that that means that internal testosterone levels are in charge of regulating female libido. One final note before we wrap up. I want to be clear, this is not me endorsing any specific kind of hormone therapy. Any hormone therapy is going to have potential risks and maybe unwanted side effects, and it is my firm belief that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all hormone therapy that is going to magically work for every female. Hormone therapy needs to be tailored to the individual seeking it by a trained medical professional. And it might be true that pending on the person, pending on the individual, testosterone-based therapy is the best intervention with the least side effects. I genuinely think it depends. So again, my intention is not to endorse a specific kind of hormone therapy. Like I said in the very beginning of this video, there is so much controversy surrounding estrogen and testosterone and which hormone is primarily responsible for regulating female libido. I think the research clearly supports that estrogen is that hormone, and I think that the way that testosterone got into the running is both a fascinating and, like I said, kind of disturbing story. And I wanted to present the research and tell the story so that you could come to your own conclusions, formulate your own opinion about the controversy. But more than anything, I think that women and people with female anatomy deserve to understand what science thinks it knows about their bodies so that they can make informed opinions and decisions when it comes to a very important, albeit unnecessarily taboo, aspect of their well-being, their sexual health. And I hope that this video brings you one step closer to that understanding. On that note, thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video or found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you didn't like it, please give it a thumbs down. Feel free to comment absolutely anything down below. Questions, content suggestions, constructive feedback, you name it. I do try really hard to read and respond to all of my comments. Don't forget to check me out on Instagram, and finally, if you want to, please subscribe to the channel for more content, not only about pelvic things like today's video, but also about life things. Thank you again so much for watching. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.